So let me talk about what we're going to segue into at this point. Um, this is what we would call the unit 6 through 10. And when I'm talking about units, I'm really kind of talking about the units within the syllabus and within the LMS, right? Your learning management system. And so 6 is going to kind of be in its own little island of like environmental. And there are only certain really oddly specific environmental things that are exceptionally testable. We'll go over a little bit more than just, the most testable ones. But after environmental, folks, we jump into agency. And agency is the first real big testable doozy chapter. But, don't panic. We'll make sure that you are all more than comfortable on it. It's just one of those things that you just kind of have to roll with it. Take it with a grain of salt. So, everybody good before I move into the next bout of stuff here? Just gauging the room to see if any of you are dying or crying inside. I don't think so. Everybody seems okay. Let's do it. Folks, environmental is obviously it's a big consideration in the real estate industry as a whole. And I'll tell you why. I always like to kind of just explain some aspects. Here's how I like to describe the environmental piece, okay? If you were not aware of this, science has not always been so sciencey. It's just the best way that I can put it. Okay, Raphael's like, it really hasn't. Folks, I mean, it really hasn't. If you're not aware of this, all right, there was, once upon a time, a gentleman who used to sell radioactive water as a curative tonic. Okay, and people would drink radioactive water because they're like, oh, that's going to cure all my ailments. I'm drinking some radioactive water. And to the extent that there's like documentation of a guy who drank it often and the bottom half of his face fell off because he had radiated the bottom half of his face. Okay, there's another documentary out there about, and some of you have probably seen it. I haven't watched it, but I'm aware of it. All the women who died of cancer because they worked at the clock factory painting the glow watches, right? I mean, there's like, because it was all radioactive stuff. And so, same thing too. Seatbelts weren't very commonly, accepted until like the late 1970s. If you look at playground equipment from, the 60s, it was all death traps, okay? And even things like lead. We're going to get into lead-based paint, but folks, there's a reason when you pump gas at the gas station, it's called unleaded gasoline. At some point, some schmuck decided it was a good idea to put lead in gasoline, and of course, that created a very toxic lead byproduct in the atmosphere. And it's not something that you should have been breathing in. So the point is, science hasn't always been so sciencey. And now in later years, 2024 that we are in, we are sometimes paying the price for the bad decisions we made or people prior to us made, because now we're realizing just how dangerous, hazardous, and otherwise certain things are. They were very commonplace at a time. Asbestos, lead, things of that nature. So when we're dealing with real estate, there's a couple big topics of concern for environmental. As I said, there's really 3 that are exceptionally testable. The other ones are matter of fact. You kind of need to know them. And so this is just kind of a visual representation of, different aspects in a house. Could be mold, could be contaminated well water, could be lead-based paint, could be near power lines, transformers, or things of that nature. And you get the electromagnetic radiation, of course, asbestos, leaking underground storage tanks, Jack dumping oil in his yard, radon gas. No, seeing if y'all paying attention there, right? Just making sure. Glug, glug, glug. Man, listen, I mean, how often does he change his oil? Maybe it's not that bad. I don't know. Formaldehyde, things of that nature. Okay, and so here's like a more comprehensive list of all the different hazardous considerations. Now, I will tell you, bar none, the first 3 are the most testable, hands down. Asbestos, lead-based paint, radon. Most testable, hands down. Not the only ones, but the most testable. I would argue that the only other one that's like really a consideration, underground storage tanks, and we'll get into that. So let's start with lead-based paint. It is the most testable environmental one. I promise it is. You will get test questions on lead-based paint. And you have to understand the exact specifications of what you need to know. So once upon a time, when I told you science didn't used to be so sciencey, lead was very commonly, let me go back real quick because it looks like some of you are still writing this list down. I'll start giving you some insight on this list and then I'll move to the next slide. Or I'll start giving you some insight on the lead and then I'll move to the next slide while you're writing this list down. Once upon a time, as I said, science not being so sciencey, lead was put into paint for a very, decent period of time. Why? Because it was used as a pigment to make colors more vibrant and as a drying agent. It actually made these oil-based paints dry faster. And so they would put lead into this paint. Now, after a period of time, it was discovered that lead was not something that's, especially good for your health. Now, let me just clarify something. If there's a block of lead sitting next to you, you're not in any danger, okay? Being near lead is not dangerous. Ingesting it, getting stabbed with it, drinking it, breathing it in, if it was aerosolized in some way, shape, or form, that can cause issues and what's called lead poisoning or things of that nature. But being around it is not super consequential. But nonetheless, lead-based paint was banned in residential homes in 1978. Notice I said residential. It was not banned in commercial. Technically, it's still not banned in commercial, but that's neither here nor there. And so, while the paint on the walls is not inherently dangerous, I told you if you ingest it or, things of that nature, it could be problematic. And so, if the paint chips flake off, fall off, get on the ground, what? Listen, I don't know about any of y'all in here, okay? I'm not naming any names, but I don't personally chew on baseboards, windowsills, or lick the floor, okay? Personally, I don't do it. Some people maybe. But you know who does? Kids and pets. Okay, they're questionable. You can't keep anything out of a kid's mouth. And so it's actually a lot more dangerous to kids anyway because they're still developing. And so because of the risks of this flaked off pieces of lead-based paint and other things can be around the property and on the property, it kind of became a concern. Now, here's the thing you have to understand. It was outlawed for use in residential in 1978. But then they realized, even though they stopped using it, there was a lot of homes being sold that still had it. And people weren't really aware that they may have lead-based paint. And so they passed a piece of federal legislation called the Lead-Based Paint Hazard Reduction Act of 1992. And what this did, and folks, this is the key takeaway piece here. You got to listen very carefully. It now required a disclosure for homes built prior to 1978. I'm going to break that into pieces there so you can really catch the most important pieces, or the most important things, to not sound redundant. That word prior is as equally important as the year 78. So if you pair those together, this disclosure is required for homes built prior to 78. What year am I really talking about? There you go. 77 and before. Be very, very careful on the test. I cannot tell you how many questions you will get that says something along the lines of a home was built in 78 and or 79. And they'll say, which of the following is true about this transaction? And I promise you the lead-based paint disclosure is going to be an option. Don't you pick it. It is not required if it was built in 78. It is not required if it was built in 79. The lead-based paint disclosure would only be required if it was built prior to 78, meaning 77 and before. Everybody with me on that? Here's the other big thing that I can tell you right here, bar none, that students try to screw up on the test. They will almost always have test questions dealing with this, and they will say something like, it has to be removed, it has to be tested, it has to be this, it has to be painted over. That is never going to be the answer. Folks, the word disclosure is what it is. When a home was built prior to 78, it requires a disclosure to be filled out by the seller. That's it. And the seller can't lie, and all they have to do is say, I do know or don't know about lead-based paint, and I do have reports and I don't have reports. That's it. There is never, listen to me, never going to be an answer choice that's they have to test it, they have to remove it, they have to do this. Never. They have to fill out this disclosure. It says I do know or I don't know about lead-based paint hazards, and I do have reports or I don't have reports. That's it. So in other words, if they know that there's lead-based paint in the home, they would have to disclose it. But if they never tested it and they don't know, they just say, I don't know. And that's meeting the requirement, bar none. Is everybody with me on that? Telling you, I see students get this wrong a lot because they're like, oh, they have to test it. No, they don't. No testing, no removing, no remediation, just disclosure. Now, the other piece of this is, technically it's every real estate agent's kind of job to facilitate this disclosure. And when I show you this disclosure here in a second, you'll see that there's a place for the listing broker and the selling broker. We'll talk about those terms more later, to sign acknowledging that they did their jobs. Well, if you're working for the seller, your job is to make sure that the seller discloses what they need to disclose. If you're working for the buyer, then your job is to give them a pamphlet put out by the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, called Lead in Your Home, What You Need to Know. And it's just information so they can make decisions on, do they care if this property potentially has lead or doesn't? Because yet again, being around a property or being around lead isn't dangerous. But of course, if you have young children and of course pregnant women who, with developing children, lead poisoning can cause major, birth defects and cognitive functions, respiratory issues, kidney failure, things of that nature. So a couple other supplemental pieces, okay? Number one, big takeaway. The lead-based paint disclosure is required in homes built prior to 1978. And it is only a disclosure. But on top of that, when we're dealing with these homes built prior to 1978, the buyer has to be given a 10-day rescission period. In other words, a 10-day evaluation period where they can say, well, I want 10 days to evaluate the property and have it tested. Or they could waive that right if they don't want it. If they say, well, I'm not worried about it, they don't have to take the 10 days, but they have to be given the right to have a 10-day period to test it and decide if there's lead-based paint hazards or whatever. Now, I will also clarify something for the real world, folks. It's not just the walls that you have to worry about on the inside of the house. You can have lead contamination in your soil for these homes too. Why? Because these homes are very often painted on the exterior with lead-based paint. And when you're dealing with exterior paint, the way that they repaint it is they go out and they scrape it and then they repaint it. So if you had lead-based paint on the exterior at any point, it gets scraped, the lead-based paint chips get in the soils, and you can have high concentrations of lead in your soil. So if your kids are going out there eating mud pies and worms, they could get lead poisoning as well. Now, of course, the fines are talking about violations for not providing disclosures when they are legally required to, and or not handling, lead appropriately under this federal legislation. But like I said, key takeaways: have to give a disclosure in homes built prior to 1978. And let me show you this disclosure real quick and show you where to find it too. Actually, it should be under this link too. There's a couple different places I think I have it embedded in the online program. Yeah, there you go. Lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazard addendum. Right there. So lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazard addendum, and there's a couple pieces to it, but of course, as I said, the key takeaways, right? Talking about the EPA pamphlet, protect your family from lead in your home. Of course, here's the seller's disclosure. Presence of lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazards are known or no knowledge, right? I do know or I don't know. And then records and reports, I do have them and I'm providing them, or I have no reports. Of course, for the buyer acknowledges the statement that the seller gave above. Buyer received that pamphlet from the EPA, and then they're either going to accept their 10-day period to evaluate it, or they're going to waive their opportunity to conduct a risk assessment. Now, the one interesting thing about this is this disclosure is a federal thing. Ours just happens to mention due diligence, which will make more sense here in a little bit when we get into contracts down the road. Some states don't have a due diligence period, so you would have to give them that 10-day period, kind of in and of itself in those states. In our state, we just kind of group it in with what we call the due diligence period. And as I said, the agents have a place to sign just like the seller and the buyer do, so we know that we met our obligations. So all it is a disclosure. I do know or I don't know. I have reports or I don't. And 10-day risk assessment period for the buyer if they want it. But I'm telling you right here, right now, everything that I just mentioned is the most testable part of the environmental. You will get questions on the lead-based paint stuff. Beverly says, so if the buyer furnishes the seller with results of reports showing contamination, the seller is now aware when they weren't aware before. Potentially, I'm trying to understand the significance of your question. Like, is there like a supplemental piece, like if there's like some legal aspect to that, or is that just a
I'm curious. So if you're under contract for a house and it has that period, and then the buyer wants to go ahead and test, and then that buyer furnishes you, the seller and the agent, with the results of that test, you can't then say I didn't know. You know what I mean? As the seller,
you're obviously in your circumstance, you're referring to if the deal falls through and they have to put it back on the market.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, right. Because obviously at that point it's a moot point. If the buyer still wants to buy it, it's irrelevant.
Sure.
But yes, if the deal falls through, yeah, they are no longer, they're not allowed to lie on this form because it's federal legislation. So now if they went back on the market, they would have to disclose there is lead-based paint contamination, and here's the reports I got from the previous buyer.
Yep. Are there situations where these older homes where a seller would say, I don't want to give someone this right to inspect the whatever for the paint?
They don't have the right to say they can't do that.
Okay.
Yeah, no. I mean, in North Carolina, our contracts, you always have the right to do inspections during a due diligence period. But because this is, once again, federal legislation, if the buyer wants it, they have to be given at least this 10-day period to evaluate. The seller can't say no. Yeah. Yeah. So here's the next one. I would argue that this is not quite as testable, but there are some key aspects to this. Of course, just like before, asbestos, like lead, is a mineral, and back in the day, it was used a lot because it had great insulating properties and it was very fire resistant, which sounds like a very beneficial thing in construction. Now, being near asbestos, just like being near lead, as I said, not inherently dangerous. Now, folks, I want to go down a tangent here, and I'm going to tell you why. I want you to just don't look at the screen. I want you to focus on my words here, and then it'll kind of make sense. This is a roundabout way to get to a point, but I've got to make it for a very obvious reason. I've told y'all multiple times that I don't know what's on your state licensing exam. I know the lady who's in charge of the exam. She's a very nice lady, very sharp lady, and I've talked to her on the regular. And if I've asked her what's on the exam, as I have in my entire teaching career, her answer is always the same. Seth, if it's on the syllabus, it could be on the test. That's all I ever get. Now, that being said, please understand that there are laws and rules that state that I could be in trouble if I ever tried to figure out what was on the exam. And likewise, you folks can be in trouble if you ever try to share what you see on the exam. So I'm going to go off on a little tangent and then I'll circle back around to my point here. I don't know if I've told y'all this yet or not, but there was a group of students, I believe it was last year now, if not the year before, it all runs together, I'm getting old, that got in really big trouble because they were in a pre-licensing class just like you. They joined some Facebook groups to help each other study and prepare for the test, but they made a very critical mistake. As some of them were going to take the state licensing exam, they were coming back and they were sharing information with each other on what they saw on the test. And the North Carolina Real Estate Commission caught wind of it, and they got into this group, and they observed it all, and there were people just like you who just went through the class and just passed their state licensing exam, but because they shared information on test questions with other students, they were barred from getting a license in the state of North Carolina. They went through all of it, and they got no license. There were several other people who got in trouble where they got a license, but they started off with a disciplinary action on their record, and it was going to be there forever. They do not take it lightly. They do not like cheaters in any way, shape, and form, whether it be class tests or real tests or otherwise. They very much frown upon it because if you're a real estate agent, you got to have some integrity. Here's the point that I'm getting at. I don't know what's on the exam, but every once in a while, I will have students come back and they'll say something like, well, Seth, they asked a question about this and I don't remember that. Or, I wasn't really sure. And of course, that's not really dangerous because I want to know if there's something that you didn't get prepared for. And very seldom is that the case. But here's what I've realized. I think some states don't care, where North Carolina cares a lot. And so I have friends who work for other states who have people come back from state test or the national test questions, and they will share the questions bar none. And then these things end up getting circulated into Prep Agent and online resources and online videos. I'm finally getting to the point of me telling you all this. When we're dealing with asbestos becomes dangerous when it breaks down into smaller particulates, and we call that friable. You see the word right there on my screen, friable. So think about sunlight beaming through your window, and you see like all little dust particles that are just naturally occurring in your air. Asbestos can break down to a certain finite form where if you breathe it in, it can cause some very serious health issues because of this friable asbestos particles. The reason why I gave you that really long story before I told you about friable and asbestos is this. There are some resources that will tell you that lead-based paint can also become friable. Because I told you, lead-based paint that's in good condition on the wall, it's not a problem. Because you're not going to breathe that in. You're not going to eat that. You're not going to do whatever. But lead-based paint that's flaking off makes it a little more dangerous because then it could be ingested. It could be whatever. So what I'm saying is, if you get a test question for asbestos and it asks when asbestos is bad, it's when it becomes friable. And if you get a test question for lead-based paint and it talks about it becoming friable and that seems like the best answer, maybe it's a valid response for lead-based paint as well. Does everybody see what I'm going at here? More than likely, there was a student who recounted a question wrong and it started making it into discussions because we've always used the term friable for asbestos. But somebody somewhere along the line thought that it might be used for lead-based paint as well. Word of caution. So, yet again, asbestos in and of itself, okay, it was in, old school popcorn ceilings and insulating tiles and, a lot of other different components and building materials. And as it ages and it breaks down and becomes friable, of course, it's more dangerous. Now, folks, asbestos can be removed, but that is not the preferred method of dealing with it. Why? I want you to think about this. Number one, it's dangerous. Number two, you have to have licensed professionals who can remove it. But if you think about asbestos, and I'm telling you that when it's most dangerous is when it's friable, what's going to happen if you take a sledgehammer to an asbestos wall? It's going to go everywhere, isn't it? And so for that reason, removal is not the preferred method of dealing with asbestos. Encapsulation is the preferred method of dealing with asbestos. Because if you just seal it behind a polymer, an epoxy, a something, and you prevent the particles from being free flowing, you've kind of made it not dangerous anymore. I'm not saying it can't be removed, but it's very costly because you have to have certified professionals to remove it. It has to go to specifically designated landfills. And because of the friable particles, you have to fully saturate it. You have to get asbestos soaking, sopping wet before you can remove it, which makes it heavier, which makes it harder to deal with. So on a test question, if it says, what is the preferred method of dealing with asbestos? Encapsulation. Sealing it up so the particles are not friable anymore. And to that point, it's not going to be the most common answer for lead-based paint, but with the tangent I just went on, if encapsulation seems like a reasonable answer for a lead-based paint question, maybe it is. I don't know. Just be careful. What you got, Tara?
Is it a solid or a liquid?
It's a solid.
Okay, because we had a house and somebody told me that there might be an asbestos tank underneath, in the storage tank underneath the house, and I was confused. So it wouldn't be in the tank?
No. I'm just trying to think of like the practical uses. Oh, we got a fresh supply of asbestos. Comes straight from the tank. You can get a fresh tap of asbestos anytime you want. It's kind of like a kegerator for asbestos. You're like, no, there's no liquid asbestos. However, there may be a tank that's partially made out of asbestos or insulated with asbestos. That could be a thing. So it may not be that asbestos was in the tank, but the tank contained it in some way, shape, or form. Yeah. Got asbestos on tap, Tara. I don't think that's a good thing. So the next one, folks, and of course the last most testable, I'm not going to say, like I said, you could see the other ones, but the last most testable one arguably is radon, okay? Radon is a gas, and it is a gas that naturally occurs from decomposing radioactive materials that are already existent in the soil. Thorium, uranium, and I can never remember the third one, but that part's not testable. When these components in the soils break down, it creates this byproduct of gas called radon. So it's basically radioactive gas. Now the key piece, folks, for this radon, it is colorless, odorless, tasteless. You will never know that radon exists unless you have a special test done. You cannot detect it just by being around it. Now, let me tell you a little bit of a joke to help you remember how you remediate radon gas, okay? Folks, radon, colorless, odorless, tasteless. You'll never smell it. It is quite the opposite of what you and your best friend will experience if you go on a road trip and one of you has the terrible, terrible idea to get Taco Bell while you're traveling to the beach, okay? Folks, listen. Imagine that that's the terrible decision that you made, and you stop and got Taco Bell, and one of you decides to hotbox the other in the car. Okay, if you don't know what hotboxing is, it's where you let one rip and you keep the windows closed. And it is terrible and it is torturous. But here's my question, because we're talking about gas here, folks. If somebody hotboxes you, yeah, turn the heat on too, Bill. That's exactly right. If somebody does that to you in the car, what is the only way to get a breath of relief? How do you fix it?
Open the window.
Open the window. And that's exactly how you remediate radon. Ventilation. So I know that was kind of a ridiculous comparison, but you're not going to forget it, right? You're going to be like, Taco Bell farts, open a window. Radon gas, open a window, right? Ventilation. If you vent it, it fixes it. And so what happens is these gases come from the soils, and most houses, because we have heat pumps, they pull air and recirculate it. So it's a negative pressure inside our houses. And so it rises up, Bill. Yeah. It's not a heavy gas that stays sinking. It rises. It's lighter than air. And so it'll get forced into your home because you're the lower pressure in your house versus the outside of your house. and then the concentrations build up and you get exposed to it. Now, folks, it's no joke, okay? It is the leading cause of lung cancer in non-smokers. It has the highest amount of deaths from lung cancer from any environmental thing in any way, shape, or form. And so they have passive systems where they just create extra vents down below the soils, but they also have active systems like you see in this picture. There's a little fan motor in there, and it, will create a lower pressure and pull it out and vent it over the house. Now, the other thing that's very testable for radon is the concentration at which it is considered a material fact and hazardous by the EPA. It is called 4.0 picocuries per liter. It's just a density of this radioactive gas in a liter of air, 4.0 picocuries per liter. Now, here's the crazy thing. That's the number at which it's considered an environmental or a material fact, and it's considered hazardous by the Environmental Protection Agency. However, 4.0 picocuries per liter, if you're living in a home with that level, it is the equivalent of smoking 8 cigarettes a day or getting 200 chest x-rays a year. That's a lot of radioactive exposure. It's no joke. Yeah, there you go. Good stuff, right? Yeah. Sounds great. And if you're wondering if you potentially have a radon issue where you live, here's a map of North Kakalaki. It is the lowest risk from Fayetteville down to Wilmington, but of course, anywhere you see purple, there is at least one house at 4.0 picocuries per liter or higher. And in fact, 1 in 5 homes have a radon issue in the entire country. So it's a very common thing. What you got, Brooks?
Is radon in water going to be on, to your knowledge, may radon in water be a testable subject
No.
on the exam?
No. It's an excellent question. Is that a thing in the real world? Yes. Obviously, it can be in well water and it can be, yes, but it's not testable.
I already knew it was a thing because my parents got sued over it. So
No, man. Yeah, so it's funny, Brooks, because we actually teach, CE classes every day or every year. And the new one that's rolled out this year actually has a section on radon and talking about testing well water for radon in your well water. And of course, there's agitation systems you can get to help mitigate those, but they're expensive, like $5,000-$6,000. When you've got, it was more than that. Oh man. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. The radon mitigation system for just the gas, typically a couple thousand, but I knew that the well system started around 5 or 6, but I guess it can go way up. So yeah, but that's not testable. Radon and water not testable in any way, shape, or form. Yeah, good question. Raphael says, how do you get rid of it? You can't get rid of it. You can remove it from getting concentrated in your house and your well with those ventilation systems we were talking about. It's called a radon mitigation system. And so it just, basically pulls the radon gas from beneath your house and vents it up above your house. So that way it doesn't build up in concentrations inside your house. What you got, Bree?
Would a new construction developer know if the land was contaminated with radon before building?
No, they don't test that before they start building. However, it has been such a common occurrence in new construction homes in North Carolina over the past couple of years that most new home builders are pre-venting for systems to be added after the fact because it's been something they've had to fix during contract for a lot of homes. So it is a very common occurrence, and they are doing things to make it easier to install a system if need be. But they're not doing like soil tests before they start building to see if there is going to be an issue. Because yet again, understand that 2 properties side by side built on the exact same soil, one house could be, having an issue with high concentrations. The neighboring property may not. So there's really no point in just testing the soil.
My friends, they found out like the week of their closing day.
Yep.
So they had to move it out.
Mm-hmm. To get that mitigation system installed, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
also one thing I didn't know is that radon in water can actually move, and it can actually cause your house to have radon in it at a later date after you close.
There you go. There's also some seasonality to it too, right? You could test in the fall and not have an issue, but test in the summer and have one, or vice versa. And I had a real estate friend of mine said she bought her house 10 years ago, had it tested, had no issue, went to go sell her house, and they had a test done, and she had an issue, and she had no idea that she had developed one over time. So it's one of those ever-changing things for sure. So, once again, biggest takeaways for radon: colorless, odorless, tasteless. Concentration of 4.0 picocuries per liter or higher is considered a material fact and hazardous by the Environmental Protection Agency. And of course, how do you remediate or mitigate radon? Ventilation. Okay, ventilation. There's passive and active systems that help vent the home. So weird. So the next one, not nearly as big of a concern in any way, shape, or form. Formaldehyde. Folks, if you're not familiar with formaldehyde, it's the stuff that the pigs and frogs were in that you had to dissect in like 6th grade, 7th grade, and stuff like that. It is a preserving agent, and that's why they use it for that, because nothing can really survive in there. And so things don't decompose if you put them in formaldehyde. And so obviously it's used in pressed boards and treated lumber and, some insulation and things of that nature to prevent, microorganisms from breaking things down and wanting to eat it some more. So, formaldehyde, it's not like you're going to be chewing on the boards as a person. Have a terrible fear of frogs. So, listen, there's way scarier things than frogs, Genesis. Okay, I don't know if you know this, but frogs are very low on the totem pole of scary, but I hear you, okay? We've all got a thing, all right? Yeah, Bill, spiders, that's the one. I hate them. Stupid creatures, spiders. So, formaldehyde, you can't really remove it. Obviously, you want treated lumber because you don't want it to be easy to break down, rot, or otherwise. Now, exposure more than anything, if you're super sensitive, kind of like with a lot of other things, it can cause irritations to eyes, nose, and throats. This last note says some studies suggesting cause cancer. Technically, those studies were in non-human mammals, aka rats and bunnies. But of course, if it causes cancer in any mammal, it probably could cause cancer in humans too. But of course, they've never tested it. But yet again, nothing too crazy. The way that you can help mitigate issues, because we can't remove it, is HEPA filters. Help prevent your irritation and things of that nature if you're super sensitive to formaldehyde or formaldehyde treated products. Funny side note, there was a fencing contractor that my clients and I reached out to one time because they wanted to install a fence in their yard. And this fencing contractor said, well, listen, as long as you want a metal fence, then we're good. And we're like, you don't do wooden fences? He said, no, I stopped doing it. And his reasoning was, I'm not kidding, apparently treated lumber used to have, on top of formaldehyde, it used to have arsenic in it. Yeah, arsenic, as in like poison, okay? But there you go. That's good stuff. But apparently he said that the quality went downhill once they took the arsenic out for, environmental reasons. They had to remove it. And he said, I'm not building them anymore because they don't last. And I'm like, well, apparently arsenic was good to help keep it preserved. So as I just said, HEPA filters could help with irritation if you're super sensitive to formaldehyde. Not super testable, right? Know it's a thing, recognize it on the test, but not super testable. Next one is mold, folks. Now, from a real estate point of view, mold is one of those, we'll say a misnomer again. Not all microbial growth is actually mold. And of course, the preferred term typically in the real estate lane is microbial growth. And if you've got a crawl space, you've got some in there. I mean, let's just be completely honest. It's just one of those things. Now, mold in and of itself, you got to be very careful. Mold in and of itself is not automatically a material fact. However, high concentrations of mold and toxic mold can be considered a material fact. Of course, when present, it can cause respiratory issues for people that are super sensitive with allergies and things of that nature yet again. But, not a crazy thing overall under most circumstances. Of course, there's really bad circumstances of it, but then it's not in and of itself a material fact. Now, here's the only other one that I would say is kind of like uniquely testable, that there's like some key pieces to remember. And it deals with underground storage tanks. Not a tap of asbestos, as Tara was talking about, right? Different type of underground storage tanks. Let me explain, and then I'll kind of give you a little bit of insight. Going back to the science not always being so sciencey thing, once upon a time, AC and heat pumps like we know didn't exist. Folks, if you ever seen Little House on the Prairie, your AC used to be open a window. Okay, like if it was not like open a window, go outside, fan yourself, take off some clothes. I don't know what you did, but you didn't have AC once upon a time. But one thing that has been around for even longer than AC, obviously, is heat. Because, you know, you can survive when it's warm pretty easily. But what you can't do is survive when it gets too cold. And so they used to have furnaces and baseboard heat and all kinds of other types of heat sources that were based off of some oil or petroleum fuel source. And because they use them, you know, so much, they started digging and putting these big metal underground storage tanks to hold the petroleum or oil product that would then feed this furnace or this fuel source heat piece. Well, as technology went on and heat pumps were invented, what had happened was people started upgrading their homes and installing heat pumps. They ran off electric, and they were dual purpose, heat and cooling. And so they no longer really had the need for these underground storage tanks that fed their furnaces or baseboard heat. And so they just ignored them, right? A lot of people just ignored them. They're just like, we don't need them, we don't use them, and they just forgot they existed. Well, folks, what happens if you put a big old piece of metal full of oil in the ground and let it sit there for 100 years and do nothing with it? Yeah, you already know. It rusts and it leaks. And so that's what happened, folks. There was so many underground storage tanks that people just abandoned in their yards, both commercial and residential, that still had petroleum or oil in it. And this goes back to me picking on Jack, because this is kind of, I mean, this is considered contamination. And so when this oil leaked out, if there was some present, it contaminated the soil, and it's considered an environmental hazard. And that can be a detriment to the property. It can be a title defect. It can be a lot of different things. Now, there was once upon a time grant money from a super fund under CERCLA, where both residential and commercial owners could apply for grant money and get assistance in cleaning up these contaminated underground storage tanks. That money is long gone. It does not exist anymore because the government said we're going to be broke. There's too many of them. And so here's the biggest takeaway, folks. Somebody who owns a property with an underground storage tank that may or may not have caused contamination, the owner is responsible for the cleanup, regardless of the fact that they're the ones installed the tank or not. Basically, in 1980, they said, we got to point the finger at somebody. So they said, okay, well, if you own the property, it's your problem, even though you didn't install the tank. Could you potentially try to find previous owners and go after them in court for reimbursement? Sure. Good luck, though. So that's the biggest takeaway. Owners of underground storage tanks are liable for the cost of cleanup, even though they're not the ones that installed them. And of course, underground storage tanks would absolutely be a material fact. And, you know, from a transactional point of view, they're kind of a pain in the butt because of the, you know, testing and things of that nature. So we are in the environmental section, not too much to go. So hopefully we'll wrap up environmental and be able to scratch the surface on some agency tonight. So we're talking about underground storage tanks, and of course, underground storage tanks are a material fact, as I was stating, because of this environmental impact, this contamination, and, you know, the liability of it being the responsibility of whoever owns the property for the cost of cleanup if present, even though they're not the ones who installed it. installed it. The other thing that I told you too is once upon a time there was money involved, but what really ties into that is I'm not going to say legislation. I mean, it was an act. It was called CERCLA. CERCLA is another one of those acronyms. It's on the next slide. You'll see it in just a second. It stands for Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, I think it is. And so basically, because there were so many of these environmental factors, like the underground storage tanks, like, people dumping stuff on their properties, and so there was other contaminations, CERCLA came about to deal with those. And so, understand that if there's any kind of like environmental impact on a property where they would deem the property contaminated, that doesn't go away, right? It is typically, unless you can clean it up, fix it, remediate it, typically it's a material fact for life that a property was contaminated by some type of waste, whether it be petroleum or, chemicals or byproducts from, manufacturing or something like that. So underground storage tanks are just one small piece of it, but there was other contaminations as well. Here it is, CERCLA, Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act. And that just goes back to the, hey, if you own a contaminated property, you're the one who's going to be looked at as responsible for cleaning it up. But you could potentially go after previous owners to seek reimbursement if you can find them. So let me ask you a couple questions. See how we're feeling. Pausing because some of you still look like you're writing. Here you go. You answer it, then I'll read it to you. Also, if any of you get this wrong, you're dead to me. I just want you to know that right here, right now. No pressure. There you go. Seeing some consistency over there. True or false, sellers / listing brokers are responsible for guaranteeing that no lead-based paint hazards exist in properties built prior to 1978. That's absolutely false. I told you, these are the kind of questions that students will screw up on a lot. And you have to understand, there's no fix it, remove it, resolve it, test it, none of that. It's disclose whether you do or you don't know. Yet again, I'm not going to say there's zero absolutes in this class, but there's very few absolutes in this class. And so if you see something like guaranteeing, that's almost never going to be the answer, right? Like there's almost never going to be anybody guaranteeing anything except for that Cajun chef. You ever watch him when you were younger? You know what I'm talking about? Beverly, did you get that reference? I guarantee. I'm pretty impressed that some of you actually got that reference. That was a stretch right there, and some of you got it, and that makes my heart happy. And those of you who don't, you should be ashamed of yourselves. I don't even remember his name, but it's just some Cajun chef that was on TV back in the day, and that was his tagline. I guarantee. It's good stuff.
How about if they're removing or changing the word instead of guarantee, they change like a disclosed.
I'm sorry, Cynthia, say that again.
No, how about instead of guaranteeing the word, they can replace, they're asking like a disclose or disclose.
Yeah, sellers are responsible for disclosing things for homes built prior to 78. That would be an entirely different question, right? So listing brokers should ensure that the seller fills out a disclosure for homes built prior to 78. That would absolutely be true. but not guaranteeing that there are no lead-based paint hazards, that there is none of that present, right? No. Raphael, I'm not sure I understand the context of your question. What after?
After 1978, is there any, if the question was written built prior to, instead of prior, after?
So that wouldn't change anything with this the context of this question, because this question is about guaranteeing something that we never guarantee. So that wouldn't change anything here. Now, to your point, though, folks understand the difference. This disclosure, this very specific disclosure, is required on properties built prior to 1978. But arguably, if there was a property that was built in 92 that for some reason had some type of lead-based paint because somebody used it when they weren't supposed to, that could potentially be constituted as a material fact that you would have to disclose if you knew about it. But what we're really coming down to for this is just understanding that the legislation states the seller has to provide this disclosure on properties built prior to 1978. And that's really what it comes down to. How about this question right here? Cheyenne, you look like you just stubbed your toe. Like, what are you doing over there?
Something I'm also be doing. I'm looking at the presidential.
Oh, you're looking at presidential stuff?
Mostly local. I'm looking at the governor thing.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Ashley, I thoroughly enjoyed the kangaroo thing. Ashley D, right? I'm like, that's pretty good information. I like that. Yeah, that was good. A lot of you answered this in the chat. True or false, having a qualified remediator carefully remove all asbestos from a property is the preferred method of abatement. That is false. Folks, what is the preferred method of dealing with asbestos? Encapsulation. My God, it's almost like y'all are learning stuff. This is amazing. Encapsulation. How about this one? Yeah, be careful with this one. True or false, the presence of radon gas in any residential property is a material fact that must be disclosed to all interested parties. No. Is it something that, you may want to be, concerned about, even if it's less than 4? Yes, but it's not really considered a material fact unless it's at 4 picocuries per liter or higher. That's that level at which the EPA says it's kind of a bigger concern, and that's where we say it's a material fact. If there was any in the house, it's not automatically a material fact. I would guarantee, like most houses probably will register something, maybe not a lot, but something. And so it's not a material fact automatically. It's that 4 picocuries per liter or higher. So short, sweet, simple little section that environmental was. Of course, there's one that didn't come into question. The electromagnetic radiation, we don't really talk about that much. It's a byproduct of being close to, super high amounts of energy and like transformers and, power lines and things like that. And there's kind of mixed views on if they can cause, health issues. And then, of course, carbon monoxide. We're going to talk about carbon monoxide a little bit later, but I'll give you a quick mention on it while it's on this vocab list here. Carbon monoxide is another gas. It's a byproduct of combustion. And it is something that is very dangerous. It's very often referred to as the silent killer. It is what comes from your exhaust pipe of your, of your cars. And it is going to be more of a topic of conversation in the property management section because property managers, landlords would be required to provide a carbon monoxide detector on every floor where there is a combustible heat source, like a heat pump that uses natural gas or something like that, or any floor where there is a garage. So carbon monoxide is, of course, a consideration, but it's only present where there's combustion. Gas stoves, gas fireplaces, gas heat pumps, garages. Folks, big word of caution for carbon monoxide as we get into the winter. Do not crank your car up in your garage with the self-start while the garage is closed. You're just trapping. You would think that would be something that people know, but don't do it, because then you're just trapping carbon monoxide in your garage. By the way, that's one of the most common ways people commit suicide, is they just crank their car up in the garage and they just wait till they die, because you just go to sleep. Anywho,